Welcome to session 1 of Think 304 Managerial Economics, and in this session we are going to be dealing with the concept of demand. I would need you to revise your notes on microeconomic theory on this session. This session is going to be totally different from that of microeconomics, but your knowledge on microeconomics is going to help you appreciate this. Remember in the video, the first session, or the introductory bit of this course, I told you that you were going to be building on your knowledge on microeconomic theory, but we're going to be taking a practical position as far as microeconomic theory is concerned. So even though you've seen the concept of demand before, we are going to be taking a practical approach as far as this is concerned. Now, why is studying demand very, very important as far as managerial economics is concerned? Remember, as managers, you can be both consumers and producers. Now, as a consumer, you would need to understand what will determine your willingness and ability to buy a good. So what will actually push you to buy a good? Studying demand is going to be helping you appreciate this. As a producer, you would also need to understand what would drive or what would push consumers to buy your goods. So studying demand would help you understand what is going to push other consumers, to purchase your good. Studying demand also would help you develop your own competitive strategy and to respond to the actions of other firms. And it will also help you to know or understand how public policy would influence the demand for your product. And for these reasons, I think that studying demand under managerial economics is very, very useful. What are the key topics to be covered in this session? We'll be looking at definition of demand and also be looking at the factors that influence demand. Remember, demand has got to do with looking at the behavior of consumers. So here we are going to be looking at the behavior of consumers separately, and we are not bringing in the behavior of producers. We are only concentrating on the behavior of consumers. I would want to refer you to your main text, Baye and Prince, titled Managerial Economics and Business Strategy, the 8th edition preferably. Otherwise, any other edition is useful. And then you turn to chapter 2 of this textbook. When we say demand, what do we actually mean? By demand, we mean a schedule that shows the quantities of a commodity that consumers are willing and able to buy at various prices at a given point in time. I am stressing very important points over here. So we are dealing with the quantities, not the quantity. The quantities of a commodity that consumers are willing and able to buy, which means that we'll be looking at several quantities of a commodity that consumers buy at their respective prices, not just one quantity and its respective price. So, for instance, if a consumer was buying a bottle of water, then we'll be looking at several quantities of the bottles of water as against their respective prices. So, at 10 bottles, what will be the price? At 9 bottles, what will be the price? At 8 bottles, what will be the price? Etc., etc. And remember, I said at a given point in time, which means that when we talk about demand, we are referring to a specific point in time. So anytime we talk about demand, we are talking about a certain month, a certain day, a certain week, a certain year, etc., etc. Now, when we are dealing with demand, we are not just referring to the individual demand, because in real life, when we have people buying our products, we will not just have one person purchasing our product. We are going to be having several people buying the products. So we are going to be talking about the market demand and not the individual demand. What do I mean by the market demand? By the market demand, we are talking about the horizontal summation of the individual demand curves. So instead of just talking about, let's say, Richard, we are going to be looking at Richard's demand for water as against Chris's demand for water, against Solomon's demand for water. And we are going to be summing all of this horizontally to give us our market demand, if we assume that these three people are the only people purchasing our bottles of water in the market. Now, if we go back and we look at the definition of demand, we see that that definition really establishes a relationship between own price of a product and how much consumers are willing and able to buy. Which means that if we're looking for factors that would push consumers to buy our products as managers, then one of the factors that we really need to consider is the own price of the product. What price are we selling our products? Now, in general, if the price of our products was high, then we would expect that consumers would buy less of the products, all other things being equal. Remember, I'm emphasizing all other things being equal here, because we are assuming that no other factor is at play here. It's only the own price of the products that we are considering. So you don't ask me that, well, the price may be high, but I have a very good taste for the product, and so I'll still buy how much I'm buying. No. We are looking or establishing a relationship between the own price of a product and how much consumers are willing and able to buy. Just that. So generally, I repeat, if the price of a product was high, then consumers would buy less of that product. And the opposite is true, holding every other thing constant. Which means that there's a negative relationship between the price of a product and how much consumers are willing and able to buy. And if you remember from microeconomic theory, this would help us draw the demand curve and therefore have a negative line showing the relationship between price and quantity, a downward sloping demand curve, I mean. This also leads us to what we call the law of demand in economics, and it states that all other things being equal, the higher the price of a product, the lower the quantity that will be demanded, and vice versa. Why would people generally buy less of a good if the price was high and more of a good if the price was low? We give two explanations for this. The first one is a substitution effect, which talks about the fact that if prices of a good, or if the price of a certain good, in this case we are using bottle of water, so if the price of a bottle of water was high, then the good would become more expensive compared to other goods. And as rational consumers, obviously if a good has become more expensive relative to other goods, you are going to be buying more of that good. And this is what we call the substitution effect. The next thing that explains why people will buy more of a good if the price was high, if the price was low, and less of a good if the price was high is the income effect. What do I mean by the income effect? Now, when the price of a good falls, the purchasing power of the consumer would increase. Remember, not the income of the consumer increasing, but I'm saying the purchasing power. At the same income of the consumer, if the price was low, how many of the goods that the consumer will be able to buy would definitely increase. And therefore, that would increase the consumer's purchasing power. And so we are able to buy more of the goods if the price of a good went down because of increased purchasing power. Now, it's not only the price of a product or your product, if you're a manager, that would push people or drive people to purchase your product or not to purchase your product. There are other factors that would influence the purchase of your product. And one main factor that we can consider here is the consumer's income. So as a manager, if you saw that consumer's income had risen or had fallen, that obviously would give you an indication of what was going to be happening to the purchase of your good. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are some goods whose purchases would go up if consumers' incomes went up, vice versa, and there are also some goods whose purchases would go up if consumers' incomes went down rather. This leads us to what you know in microeconomics already, which is normal goods and inferior goods. For normal goods, if consumers' incomes went up, they'll buy more of those goods and vice versa, meaning that for normal goods, there's a positive relationship between those goods, the demand for those goods and consumers' income. And then for inferior goods, if the incomes of consumers went up, they'll rather buy less of those goods, meaning that for inferior goods, there's a negative relationship between those goods, the demand for those goods, and consumers' income. So, for instance, beginning of this year, we saw that consumers' income had gone up, coming from the increment in the salaries of civil servants. That meant that if you're a producer and if you're a manager and you're offering a normal good, then the demand for your good is obviously going to be increasing. If, however, you are offering inferior good, then the demand for your good was going to be going down. Another factor that would influence the price, the demand for your product as a manager, is the price of related goods. We looked at this in microeconomics as well, but just to revisit it. By price of related goods, or by related goods, we can talk about substitutes and complements. What are substitutes? Substitutes are goods that serve the same purposes, so like Milo and this way, for instance. And then complements are goods that can be used together, or goods that have to go together. Now, if the price of a substitute good went up, then obviously the demand for the good that you are producing as a manager would increase, which means that there's a positive relationship between the price of a substitute good and the demand for the good that you are producing. So here you are looking at the relationship between the price of a substitute good against the demand of the good you are producing. For complements, if the price of a complement good went up, then the demand for the good that you are producing would go down. Remember, complements are consumed together. So if the price of a complement good went up, the demand for that good would go down, and therefore the demand for the good that you are producing, which is a complement to that product, would obviously also go down. So for complements, there's a negative relationship between the price of the complement good and the demand for the good that you are producing as a manager. Size of the market is also a factor that would obviously influence the demand for your product. If the size of the market increased, then the demand for your product would obviously increase. And that's obviously the reason why demand for most commodities are higher in a place like China than it is in Ghana, because the size of China's market is bigger than that of Ghana. You can also think about other factors like taste and preferences. So if a taste of a particular the taste that consumers have for a particular product is good, then they will demand more of that product. If the taste was bad, they will demand less of that product. And by taste, we are considering factors like cultural beliefs, fashion, etc., etc. Now, we are learning all these factors because we want to be able to know the factors that will drive people to buy our products as managers. And so we should bear that in mind. Now, there's a concept that we learned in microeconomics, and I just want us to recap that concept because it will be useful when we get to session 3. And that was the distinction between change in demand and change in quantity demanded. When we talk about change in demand, we are looking at shifting the demand curve bodily, and that obviously would arise from a change in all the other factors that influence demand apart from the own price of the product. So incomes, price of related products, etc., etc., would shift the demand curve either to the right or to the left. When we talk about a change in quantity demanded, then we are looking at moving along the same demand curve, and that obviously arises from a change in the own price of the product. Please do not forget this concept as we move to the other sessions. Taking you to the application bit, then we can also represent demand in a mathematical way, apart from representing it in a tabular form and, let's say, in a graphical form, which we saw that there's a negative relationship between demand and the price of the product. We can represent it in the mathematical way. And this that you see over there, this equation or this function shows you a function that describes the relationship between demand and the other factors and the factors that influence demand. So here we've put the price of the own price of the product, which is product X, and then the price of related products, which is PY. M represents income, and H would represent all other determinants that we've not considered here. So if we take it into the equation form, then we expect to have the equation that we have below. QDX equals alpha naught plus alpha XPX plus alpha YPY plus alpha MM plus alpha HH. Now, if we're supposed to be putting figures to this, then considering the law, what the law of demand says, then we expect that alpha X would have a negative sign because there's a negative relationship between the price of the product and the quantity of that product. We expect that if the relationship between PY and QX is positive, that is, if alpha Y was positive, then we'll be dealing with substitute goods. If alpha Y was negative, we obviously will be dealing with complement goods. Again, if alpha M was positive, we are referring to, M refers to the income of the consumer. So if alpha M was positive, we'll be dealing with a normal good. If alpha M was negative, we'll be dealing with an inferior good. Now, we would look at the concept of consumer surplus and producer surplus later on in this course.